Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 22. The Chieftains Hall at Ksurgis was incredibly busy during 169 prior, I would judge, for clients and cases were noted in the records many times every day. Aristippus presided and heard all manner of ludicrous cases where the lack of evidence did nothing to lessen the fantastic nature of the claims being made or requests being submitted. It could be that the Hernanians wished to test the limits of the young governor, or it may indeed be, as is usually cited, that this was precisely the same type of spurious dispute the Hernanians usually took to the authorities, whereby it would be solved through combat or political favours, with no sense of material justice. Since the Hernanians do not seem to be like this today, I wonder if this was an invented tale of earlier times. These I find often, and rarely can they be relied upon. Pairisades was often present at this court, although not as an authority in an official capacity. He was there to quench his own thirst for local gossip, and to show off the lavish clothing he had acquired, demonstrating the Hernanian style. Combined with Prince Aristippus's attempts to speak the Marcomanni dialect, it invokes one to imagine quite a farcical scene. It sounds like the discipline needed to maintain a distant imperial possession was not enforced in the standard way. This had no effect on the outcome, however, so one cannot be quick to criticize it. Also present was witness Diotrephes, whose principal responsibility was overseeing the army camp outside the city. Evidently he was not always present there, because he had a family who lived in Apollon that he regularly travelled to see, a week's ride. Pairisades had a family there, of course, and I think that Diotrephes' visits were meant to attend to them also. Recall that Diotrephes was officially a member of their family, yet hardly anyone speaks as if this was a legitimate arrangement. One day Diotrephes returned with a matter he took straight to Pairisades, and this turned out to be that the strategos had realized his eldest child, a daughter named Enyo, was past 16 years of age and was harassed daily by potential suitors in the city. Diotrephes had rushed to the king to arrange a higher rank of marriage before the opportunity was wasted. Pairisades asked what Diotrephes' wife had to say on the matter, and Diotrephes confessed he was not sure, since he was not in the habit of consulting her. Nor, I might add, did Pairisades ever consult his wife about household matters, although in that case it would be more accurate to say that she never consulted him, since she was the primary agent of those affairs. This is usually the way in noble houses, although less common among royal households by my experience, wherein often officials will be hired to free the family of childbearing burdens and enable greater freedom and productivity, and indeed greater fecundity for important lines. We can tell by the way Diotrephes and Pairisades were at an impasse regarding how to marry Enyo correctly that they did not have a very ordinary or a very efficient household model. Such is the wage of those very concerned with the households of others above their own. To address the matter, both returned to Apollon. This departure is often credited for scuppering a planned offensive campaign, although I think that snow and unreliable maps had already played the crucial part by the time this decision was made. In the Apollon citadel, they happened upon a useful connection. A large embassy from Alexandria had arrived in the city and was in the process of being welcomed by the Scions of Gold establishment. The king uproariously interrupted their feast with an elaborate entrance, supposedly involving a large number of Ephebi running into the hall ahead of him with burning branches of exotic incense. This was the type of pageantry that the Egyptians especially enjoyed. There, Pairisades was able to ingratiate himself with a man named Biton, whose rank was something akin to Archon of Alexandria, which in practice made him a sort of Archon to all Egypt. Pairisades wasted no time in sharing word of Enyo with Biton, and there was quick approval that a match could be made here. This was a strong political move, because it can be thought of as being equivalent to marrying into the Ptolemaic royal line. Doing so properly was very difficult, because they preferred to intermarry with their own dynasty, which almost all peoples across the world will agree is an affront to the natural order, and hence all manner of maladies are supplied by the fates to those that practice it. This created a strong alliance on top of the existing contract of military aid, and additionally it allowed the negotiation of even higher tributes due in payment for said aid. And considering that Bosporan forces were hardly aiding Egypt, rather taking what the Ptolemies had planned to take themselves, I think this arrangement was unreasonably harsh on Biton and his court. Biton was well aware of this, and if one seeks out the records of things he had said, you will find that he was extremely critical of the Bosporan involvement in Egyptian affairs. After the marriage, one will find less of this, but personally I think he simply became more careful in his public statements, never ceasing to scheme ways to undo the arrangement. This was only going to become harder, because while he was Prime Minister and Councillor to Ptolemy XII, he was now grandson-in-law to Pairisades of the Bosporan Empire. This is an odd thing to say, because Biton was not much younger than Pairisades, and yet in House Ptolemy there are far more twisted dynastic arrangements to be seen, making all this quite easy to understand and accept by comparison. The agreements were cemented with endless feasts and demonstrations of magic by the Scions of Gold, who impressed the Egyptians by showing a method to keep a bull alive for a very long time during a bloodletting, so that many prayers could be sent to the cosmos and be digested by the earth. After several weeks, the Alexandrians were permitted to leave, with Enyo added to their retinue, alongside her 30 household attendants, tutors and guards. The people of Byzantium gave them a large ship as a wedding gift, easing their travel back to Alexandria. Let us go with them and see how the news of this development affected the mind of Doreius, the man whose niece, who he had never met, was now pinning the Bosporan cause to the Ptolemaic one with inconvenient clarity. As the winter of 169 prior fell, the success of the prince's restraint on the local Ptolemaic men was evidenced through the bypassing of a city called Amida. This city was to the northeast of Edessa, and was known for facilitating trade caravans transitioning from the mountains of Asia and the plains of Mesopotamia. Since the city was allied to the Seleucids, attacking this region was justified at first glance, but strategists will tell you that it is usually better to take a city quickly and without offending and wounding the citizens so much that they become compelled to stand against you. The Ptolemies had taken to raiding the farms and villages in order to fulfill certain requirements that their young king had placed upon them, those being that this or that amount of loot needed to be returned to Tarsus for shipping each month. Since the soldiers still delighted in taking this loot, I'm using a euphemism here to be clear, no matter what Doreius said to them, there was much violence in the hinterlands, which drove people and resources to the city. There they were armed and trained quickly. All people who lived there felt that warfare was their best recourse, in which they were likely correct. So it was that Doreius became aware that a fresh army was suddenly appearing close to him, forcing him to rally what troops he could to maintain parity. Ordinarily, raising troops from recently conquered lands would be difficult for most rulers, yet Doreius was popular enough that his brilliance attracted former enemies to his side. He was aided here by a historic rivalry between Edessa and Amida, because the former was said to have been long influenced by the Armenians, who were the people who lived in the mountains of East Asia. Those Armenians were held under constant suspicion by the Greeks, because they had attempted to quit their obligations to their Seleucid suzerains many times over the centuries, with little sign that they had remorse or loss enough to not try again at the earliest opportunity. Therefore, the raising of an army at Amida could be turned through rhetoric into a sort of rebellion against the Edessans' former masters, to whom some had blind loyalty and others pined for because the new order had come at such an unforgivable cost. Doreius seized upon this. I think it was not especially true that Amida was linked closely to the Armenians, from all I can tell, especially as there is no close link in modern times, nor any sign that this state of affairs was different to what people's ancestors spoke of. However, the hinterlands that the Ptolemies were happily plundering were packed with Armenian clients and informal settlements. Attacks here brought news and calls for aid to the court of the Armenian king, Ubalnu, where they were impossible to ignore. In this way, then, the events at Amida really were a sign of stirring Armenian militarism. It is only the idea that this was happening in a dishonourable or treacherous way which was invented. Doreius took his army and set Amida to siege, preventing any further mustering for the time being. He received embassies from Ubalnu's servants, who made clear that they were under the obligation of vassals to oppose this siege, and further under obligation as rulers to oppose the general encroachment of the Bosporan alliance. Doreius thanked them for their forthrightness, and dispatched the envoys back with gifts. Then he sent word of this to his cousin in Hierosolyma, who was very exposed to the way in which the Armenians had arranged their garrison towns in Syria, although we shall discuss this in detail later. As for the Ptolemaic reaction to all this, once they heard that the Armenians were planning to come out of the mountains, they recalled their outriders and began to march west and south to escape the theatre, their baggage trains so full of loot already that it would be mad to risk battle for any further potential prizes. Of course, this was a violation of their military obligations, but I think to expect that level of propriety from men like those is too naive, so I will not even criticize their failings in this regard. That is not to say Doreius disapproved of this course. In fact, he had ordered them to make this withdrawal for months prior. Whether it was fear of the Armenians that changed their minds at last, or whether they respected that Doreius was now family to their own supreme commander Beton, I shall leave you to speculate. The siege was several months long, during which time Doreius kept his troops busy with drill, scouting, and most importantly, the engineering of several siege towers and wheeled ladders with which to threaten the city. Indeed, there was no time for a long reduction of the city, which would not surrender or cease to be a menace otherwise. Therefore, all work was being done in anticipation of a large-scale action to make the city the prince's own. It might be the case that some inside the city were interested in the idea of being subject to the prince over Kairos, or whoever else the Seleucid court claimed was king from their anonymous roster of oligarchs. I make this claim because what I have read of Antioch and Edessa indicates that the people were enjoying a new sort of justice, one that I believe was enabled by the very horrors of the prior destruction. Since the cities were being remade without many of the established households, it was not only easy but natural for a universal system of laws and justices to be enacted, very much in accordance with what Pairisades and Doreius had been wishing to do to all lands. This was a system in which it was very hard to be exempt from laws, or for laws to be adaptable to circumstances in such a way that one who could be inconvenient for the state to criminalize was able to enjoy freedom in cases where lesser men would be punished. To put this more bluntly, the rich of the city were not immediately able to break the law in the way they would have been used to in other cities. This was the central notion of citizenship under the Golden Age model, although the actual goal was to eliminate the need for justice outright. The experiment that Antioch and Edessa provided showed that it was very easy to conduct business when assurances were given that other businesses could not undermine you, and for the common citizens it was even better, since it became very difficult for a powerful man to force someone into slavery or come up with arbitrary reasons to withhold payment for services. I think it was not as good as I make it sound, really, but there is much agreement that something good was being achieved. That is why I think other cities might have heard rumours that prospects for Doreius' cities were good, whereas it was hard to hear that coming from other cities in that part of the world, while other rulers were so sick with men of degenerate pedigrees of many generations. To achieve these things, Doreius had appointed a man named Eutychius to be witness of the king in Syria. Even though Doreius did not have the power to appoint someone to this rank, Eutychius was imagined to have the power to ratify his own accession, defeating the legal challenges that arose among the Chariskos Demiurgi when they heard of this much later. Eutychius had been instrumental in the reconstruction of Philippopolis, acting as magistrate and judge with such a calm and wide-ranging sense of justice that Doreius constantly relied on his counsel. The experienced Scions of Gold priests found him pious, noting that he was respectful towards the cosmic gods, while being entirely devoted to the gods of our world, the tripartite and the paragons. Thanks to this, he was selected as an appropriate ruler according to all criteria which Diaz identified as being in line with Manos's order in the earliest days of the world. That was enough to guarantee his success, and hence it is no wonder that Syria was becoming like a flower to which all insects were drawn. This flourishing is the fate of our entire world, so envy not those old Edessans now. Not all of the witnesses were chosen with so much consideration and proof of their ability. Since I have broached the topic, I will tell you about another witness of the king who was given power at around the same time. His name was Cleonicus, a relatively unknown man before this point, who had been someone with whom Pairisades had kept a middling level of company for some years. Suddenly he was brought to the forefront of the dynasty's business because of a passion he held: the alteration of slavery. This was relevant, of course, in the shadow of the dispassion for the same held by witness Kilix, and the resultant discord of Pannonia reaching a boiling point. The slaves there had become impossible to control, and even seemed to gain access to arms through unknown means. The arms were of Illyrian make, and thus it is easy to conclude the Romans were somewhere behind the chain of conspirators, as Rome's influence over Illyria was great. Roman armies marched around the region as if on campaign, while not actually fighting anyone, in order to show their might to all the minor towns and establish outposts along their border. Pairisades was all but forced to free these slaves in order to avoid simply killing them. This latter recourse would have been popular with the Romans, no doubt, yet not appropriate for the circumstances. Firstly, Pairisades had struggled to find enough unlanded or enterprising people to form the colonies needed to establish Pannonia. Secondly, he was not so unenlightened as to think that a king might order his own people be killed without everlasting effects on the health of our very reality. Thirdly, his army was not interested in the business. Fourthly, said army was separated from Apollon along the very lines of communication the Pannonians were best placed to cut. In conclusion, there could and should be no war in a situation like this. Hence, Cleonicus was sent to speak with the slaves and find a way to free them that would not interfere with the cultivation of the land. This sometimes was thought to be possible, since there had been no slavery in the Golden Age, and Cleonicus was the least skeptical of all the officers in the king's company. It proved rather easy, for him at least, because of a similar reason to the success of witness Eutychius. There were not many rich families established yet with rights to challenge the king's directives. Slaves could be freed without a great outlay of money or consolation of offended parties, but that was not the part of the process people were worried about. Would the work of the yearly cycle carry on properly if the management of the labour involved became difficult or in conflict with the so-called rights of the citizenry? In the short term, failure was expected here. However, since the attempt at this approach was able to calm the civil unrest in the region, Cleonicus was left to follow his own course. Such was the right of one named Witness of the King, after all. In retrospect, I can report that his measures were a success. This is not debated now, but in previous decades, when similar issues arose elsewhere, scholars could not agree on whether being free is fundamentally a more productive state of being than being a slave, or whether something about the specific conditions of the Pannonian colonies created this effect by overriding the expected decline. I think the former school has won out after repeated experiment, although there is ground still for use of the latter school, and I have been convinced here and there that certain tasks simply cannot be left to those with full legal rights without making a mockery of those rights by guaranteeing their violation or watering down their universality. This can be left aside, and one need only know that the Pannonian situation began to decline from a dangerous peak thanks to Cleonicus, allowing Pairisades to return to Kysurgis to oversee the frontier before spring. There he was to monitor rumours of enemies and write many messages, implying that the Kysurgis army could not be trusted, and I'm sure he had good reason to think this. At least there was peace, no matter how uneasy it was, for the people attempting to acclimatise to the new and superior ways the Bosporans were planting. There was action in Syria for the spring, for both the princes engaged in that theatre. Firstly, I will cover Prince Dion. He had won 2 large battles against the outcast Judeans in the previous year, bringing that unrest to the point of being materially impossible to carry on. Foreign powers would ensure otherwise, yet for a time there was pause and a semblance of order. With this in hand, he deployed his army into the field to face the Armenian garrisons that surrounded Palestine. His army was filled with Egyptian levies who had been paid handsomely to switch their allegiance to him. Supplementing this were fresh colonists hired from Greece and the Black Sea, including the Cimmerian companies once commanded by his father. Their loyalty to the Spartakids was as perfect a thing as a subject people has ever achieved. As I had mentioned before, Dion had been maintaining plans to capture several inland cities because he thirsted to build himself a private domain from the seeds he had been gifted by fate. Therefore he was quick to organize a march on his first and favored target, Palmyra. Palmyra was a city that controlled the overland trade between Palestine and the rich lands of the east, and to a lesser extent trade from Antioch. Additionally, it was itself a rich city that had been sovereign over its lands in the past. Long ago, it began to be traded between empires, as many cities of the region had, and the Seleucid Empire was only the most recent occupier. In the time of Elector the Humble, the city had been passed over to the control of the Armenians, along with all towns and cities along a line south that cut the western coast of the Seleucid Empire from the main body. The intent was to ease the burden of the anticipated war with the Ptolemaic Empire, and the actual outcome was that fewer troops were under a single commander, and thus able to quickly react to the incursions when they came to pass. Now, many years after the danger crested the coast, it was seeping into the Empire's satrap shield with force that would be hard to match. Since all that happened at first was that Dion besieged Palmyra, I will tell you of a grander military feat that took place in tandem, the storming of Amida. Doreius recognized that the best fortress he could hope to man to answer the threat of Armenia was the very city in his grasp, and that was part of the reason he had not broken the siege when word of war found him. Once he had built 3 siege towers and assorted ladders, he moved to scale the walls and take the city intact. Ordinarily, commanders might opt to sap the walls to gain entry, however there would be no time to rebuild them if danger was to be close in the assault's wake. Amida lacked any geographical advantages, being situated on a hill so modest it could easily escape notice when viewed at short distances, lacking rough terrain, marsh or rivers that might simplify its defense. It was only in this place because ancient roads had passed by a spring here. It was good luck which had prevented the city being razed in the wars which had visited the boundary between mountains and plains on a regular basis. When Doreius came, there was no direction from which he could not instruct his men to approach. Here is how he apportioned the assault. Against the long flat wall guarding the north of the city, he sent his Greeks and Bosporans. Bosporans in the pure sense, in that they were from the Bosporus region of the Black Sea. This attack was made without any of the towers, relying on quick-footed light infantry bearing ladders to suddenly appear at the walls. This attack failed dismally, because the Amidan troops rushed to meet them. In particular, they had several hundred mercenaries from Crete who were master archers, and so it was impossible for many attackers to get close to the walls. Of course, Doreius had not expected the walls to be taken by his first thrust. It was simply a move to impress upon the enemy the need to defend that area, while in reality, Doreius had many troops hidden in the siege towers located elsewhere. First of these was the one moving in from the east. This tower held warriors from Tarsus and parts of the Kingdom of Pergamon, while the men pushing it were Daxians Doreius had bought from slavery, from his own father no less, when he had founded Philippopolis. They quickly brought the tower to a jaunty part of the wall in the southeast of the city, which had been left barely defended in the panic to stop the main assault elsewhere. Therefore, the whole contingent mounted the wall with only a few missiles offered in objection, and none dared stand on the walls to forestall the capture of the nearby gate and roads. The Daxians set the roof of the gatehouse on fire to signal their success, and it is said that an accident in arranging this killed more men than the action of capturing the mighty stone fortifications in the first place. The 2 remaining towers moved together against the jagged, irregular southern wall. This wall had been collapsed and repaired many times over the centuries, bearing the brunt of attacks from the great civilizations of the plains since it was closest to the stone road and flat camping grounds. These towers housed Egyptians and Syrians, whom Doreius considered his least reliable troops. Whatever motivated that misgiving, they appeared to have performed well, quickly capturing 2 gatehouses and facilitating the movement of all remaining troops into the city streets. In particular, several hundred steppe horsemen, who struck panic into all with their world-weathered and battle-hungry behavior. This could have marked the fall of the city, and Doreius wished to find someone he could ask to officiate a surrender, but the battle did not end. Inside Amida, the Greek quarter was also fortified with a lesser wall that protected the temples and public offices. Here the defenders went to carry on the fight, although some came and battled in a disorderly manner throughout the streets. Doreius had intended to avoid damaging the city very much with his attack, it seems, and was not happy that the enemy refused to surrender. This was because it caused his soldiers consternation that drove them to enact violence against the people and to take compensation wherever they found it. It would be difficult to instruct such a disparate and landless army to act any differently if one also expected them to face mortal danger. Therefore, while the city endured a difficult day, it was the garrison commanders who were most to blame for prolonging the atmosphere of dare and danger. Inside the agora of the Greek quarter, there was more orderly action. The Cretans and other mercenaries did not want to fight, but men from the city itself were compelled to defend this area with mad bravery. The detail of the actions consisted of men charging with shields raised to attempt to dislodge the step archers and levied spear carriers besieging the civic buildings. And every time this happened, the step archers would untie their horses and ride around the agora chanting horrid songs and loosing arrows until the Amidan men were dead or in flight. Doreius kept his army inside the city during the night, resulting in its complete pacification by morning. Those locked up in the civic buildings were given surrender so that these important places could be taken intact. Doreius was given a tour by the city's leading men, and he wrote that he enjoyed all the things that private collectors had given to the city's people as gifts, so that they could be displayed in the temples and courts. It was as if the man who had been a conquering general the previous day was a wealthy client on a tour the next. It was within the prince's character and ability to be both of these things with ease, and to have the wisdom to select the occasion for each. That is how Amida came to be part of the Bosporan Empire, in another blow to the Seleucids, who were still preparing their response. In truth, they did not need to do much, because Doreius did not have many soldiers who could be kept on campaign for more than a month or two, given the obligations men of the region had to the scoured cities and towns the Ptolemies had left in their wake. Therefore, the Bosporan position here was very weak, and it was only the weakness of others that let it be. In other words, the perilous spirit of Amida now pervaded the whole line of Bosporan settlements all the way to the sea. The Armenians might well have exploited this, however they were rather more concerned with the direct attacks on their garrisons underway to the south, and it was there they were going to march their armies first. Whether this was wise or foolish depended entirely on whether they could defeat Prince Dion quickly, and hence win victory in the entire theatre. Elsewise, they were giving up easy victories in one part to only delay defeat in others. The campaign of King Obalnu against Dion, then, must be the next topic I cover. There is an appendix to something I discussed previously that I will write here so as not to disrupt the structure of the next chapter. It is about the witnesses of the king that were coming to be involved in more and more of the government's legal rulings in local matters. If you've been keeping close count, you will note that by this time there were 5 men with the rank of witness of the king: Diotrephes, Cilix, Aeneas, Eutychius, and Cleonicus. You will likely be aware that the senior 5 witnesses ever since this time were held in higher regard than others, and that the most senior was even more prestigious. The reason for this is a little odd, so I will take this chance to tell you that this tradition was first imagined around the time of the fall of Amida by men who were not subject to the witnesses' power, yet lived in awe of it, the so-called Flavians of Rome. This was a group of philosophers who had opposed the rise of the Caesars in their rhetoric, then in practice being tactfully soft so as to avoid material punishment for backing the wrong horse, so to speak. They looked upon the system of witnesses as something akin to their own practice of dictatorship, which is inaccurate, but the Romans always saw the world as if it was organized based upon their own experiences. They found the idea that a king's power could be delegated between many people to be desirable, crediting it as possessing positive qualities of dictatorship and positive qualities of confederate styles of rule, without especially mixing in the negative qualities, or at least not forming any new considerably negative effect. The condition that there should be 5 witnesses, and that one should be senior, arose entirely from their mistaken interpretation that this was how Kings Spartacus and Pairisades had ordained the system to be. In truth, there were no such limits ever mentioned before the Romans set them to page. Then afterwards they began to be referenced in the Greek world as well, because the writings of the Flavian school were widely distributed and discussed in academic circles. Even when people were sure the Romans were mistaken, the height of the praise the writers gave to their imagined system tempted proud Bosporans to pretend that it was real, rather than risk criticism of the actual arrangement. I find this very amusing. This is the origin of the term quincunx, which you might have heard being used to refer to the 5 senior witnesses in the same way that tripartite is used to refer to Manos, Ymo and Taurius. If you have any experience with the Roman language, called Latin, after the Latii people who invented it 8 centuries ago, you will note that quincunx is certainly a Roman word and not a Greek one. The influence of the Flavian school is behind this. Notably, in Latin, the word refers to a system of 5 elements where one element is given precedence and the other 4 are equal, and was originally used in the field of geometry. That this actually leaked through in the real politics of the world they were struggling to find the correct terms to describe is rather cute, and it is entertaining to find such details like this in the history of knowledge, when knowledge always seems so eternal and without such contrivances. With all that aside, I have more knowledge to impart upon you, so allow me to begin a new chapter.